the moment my husband looked at me across the dining table and said, "Eleanor, I want a divorce," I felt the room tilt slightly to one side. But that wasn't the part that truly stopped my breath. It was what he said next, with the calm confidence of a man, announcing the evening news. "And I'm taking everything." The words landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. For 41 years, we had shared this house. The walnut floors that groaned softly in the cold months. The cream-colored kettle that whistled too early every single morning. The wide bay windows that filled the front room with pale golden light on winter afternoons. And now Victor Hargrove, 71 years old, and suddenly, standing straighter than I had seen him in years, was looking at me as though I were a tenant he had decided to evict. The house, the accounts, the mountain cabin, he continued, folding his hands very neatly on the rosewood table. "My lawyer says it's all quite clear." I stared at him, trying to understand how the man I had cooked for, cared for, and quietly defended for most of my life could speak with such cold certainty. Outside, the wind moved through the old birch trees along the fence line, shaking the iron wind chime Victor had once insisted on hanging himself. Funny how quickly things that felt permanent could start sounding hollow. "You're serious?" I said quietly. Victor gave a short laugh. Not the warm sound I remembered from years ago, something sharper, more polished. "Eleanor, I've been serious for months." Months. That word slid under my ribs like a thin blade. So while I was tending the rose garden, he had been planning this. While I was fixing the loose latch on the pantry door, he had been sitting somewhere with a lawyer, deciding exactly which parts of my life he intended to take. "And you believe the house is yours?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair, confidence practically radiating off him. "It's in our marriage agreement. Everything is. Don't make this difficult." I studied his face. The neat, silver mustache he trimmed every Sunday morning. The faint scar near his left temple from when he fell on the boat dock 18 years ago. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire life we'd shared. Then I noticed the folder near his elbow. Legal paper, typed tabs, prepared. Victor had not come to talk. He had come to declare victory. "You've already filed," I said. He smiled slowly. "Of course." There was something almost theatrical about the way he said it, as if he had rehearsed this scene many times. Before walking into my dining room tonight, I stood and walked to the window. The backyard stretched out in quiet evening light. The rose beds, the old wooden bench, the narrow path to the garden shed, where Victor used to spend long hours pretending he enjoyed building things. 41 years. And now he spoke as if I were a guest who had overstayed. Behind me, I heard the rustle of paper as he slid the folder slightly across the table. "You should look at the documents," he said. "It'll help you understand how this is going to go." I turned back slowly. Victor's confidence wasn't just arrogance. It was certainty, the kind that comes from believing. Every piece on the board is already in place. He thought he had already won. What Victor Hargrove didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that years ago, after one particular night, when I finally understood what kind of man my husband truly was, I had made a very quiet decision, a decision that would one day matter very, very much. But Victor had never asked about paperwork. Victor had never asked about the house. And Victor had never imagined that the quiet woman sitting across from him might understand far more about ownership than he did. "Hello, my dear friends. Eleanor here. Well, I'm Grace, and I'm telling you Eleanor's story. Tell me honestly, if someone you spent 40 years with suddenly told you they were taking everything, how would you react? Write it in the comments." And don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these stories together. Victor tapped the folder again, impatience creeping into his voice. Well, he said, aren't you going to read it? I looked down at the stack of legal pages, then back at the man who believed he had already erased me from my own home. And for the first time since he walked into the dining room, I smiled. Victor, I said calmly, you might want to be very careful about what you think belongs to you. His smile faltered, just for a second, and in that small moment of silence between us, I realized something important. My husband had spent months preparing to take everything, but he had never prepared for the possibility that the house was never truly his to take. Victor did not like my smile. I saw immediately in the way his fingers stopped tapping the folder. For 41 years, he had studied my reactions, the way some people study road maps. He knew when I was frightened. He knew when I was tired. And he especially knew when I was about to give in. But this smile didn't fit any of those categories. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked to the kitchen counter where the cream kettle had just begun its quiet pre-boil whisper. It was an old enamel kettle, slightly chipped near the handle. Victor had once called it an eyesore. I kept it anyway. Small rebellions become habits after 40 years. I'm making tea, I said calmly. Eleanor. His voice had hardened, but I poured the water slowly into a teacup, dropped in a sachet of Darjeeling, and sat back down at the table as if we were simply discussing the weekend weather. Victor stared at me like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. You're taking this very calmly, he said. Well, I replied, stirring my tea. It's not the first unpleasant surprise this marriage has delivered. That landed. His jaw tightened, but he pretended not to notice. Look, he said, sliding the folder toward me again. You can fight if you want. That's your right. But Marcus says it'll only make things harder for you. Marcus. So that was the lawyer's name. You've hired someone already? I said. Of course I have. How long? Victor hesitated, and that tiny pause told me more than any confession would have. A while, he muttered. I opened the folder. Inside were exactly the kinds of papers I had expected. Asset summaries, bank statements, property evaluations, and a neatly typed proposal for division. Victor had highlighted several sections in yellow, like a proud student presenting his homework. The house, the retirement accounts, both vehicles, the mountain cabin. According to this tidy stack of paper, Victor Hargrove intended to walk away with nearly everything. I turned another page. His reasoning was simple, insulting, really. The document described him as the primary financial contributor. Throughout the marriage, it mentioned my limited independent income. It even implied that running this household and managing 41 years of daily life counted for considerably less than a regular paycheck. I let out a quiet breath. Marcus wrote this. I asked. Yes, he's very confident. Victor leaned back again, his earlier swagger returning. That's because the law is clear, Eleanor. I closed the folder. The law. Funny word. The thing about Victor was that he loved simple explanations, clean answers, straight lines. He had always believed life worked like the user manuals. He kept sorted in the garage. Step 1. Step 2. Finished. But real life, especially legal life, rarely followed user manuals. You should probably start thinking about where you'll go. He added casually. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. And where exactly do you have in mind? I asked. Victor shrugged. Your sister's, perhaps, or one of those retirement communities, near the park. I'm sure you'll manage. For a moment, the kitchen felt very small. The rosewood cabinets, I had refinished myself one summer. The clay jar filled with dried lavender stems. The narrow shelf where I kept my favorite recipe book. The one with the handwritten card for lamb stew that Victor used to ask me to make every winter. All of it suddenly looked different, not because it was leaving me, but because Victor believed it already had. You've really thought this through, I said. I have. And you're certain the house belongs to you? Victor smiled again. Yes. That confidence, that dangerous, comfortable certainty. I folded my hands in my lap and studied him carefully. The man sitting across from me had spent months planning how to dismantle my life. He had lawyers, paperwork, and a very expensive belief that he understood the law. But Victor Hargrove had always had one significant flaw. He never looked closely at the details he assumed were beneath him. And this house, it was nothing but details. I suppose we'll see what the court says, I said quietly. Victor snorted. Oh, Eleanor, the court is going to say exactly what I just told you. He stood, took the folder, and walked toward the hallway. Start thinking about where you'll go, he said over his shoulder. I'd hate for this to drag on unnecessarily. A moment later, I heard the bedroom door close. The house fell silent. I finished my tea slowly, staring at the dining table where we had celebrated birthdays, argued over bills, and once spent an entire evening trying to assemble a garden shelf Victor had bought impulsively at an estate sale. 41 years. And now he thought he could erase me with paperwork. I stood, walked to the small cabinet beside the refrigerator, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thin leather folder, older, thicker, containing documents Victor had never once bothered to read. I ran my fingers slowly across the edge of the papers and allowed myself the smallest breath of relief, because Victor was right about one thing. The court would absolutely decide who this house belonged to. And when that moment came, my husband was going to learn something very, very surprising. He had spent months preparing to take everything, but he had no idea what he was truly walking into. The next morning, Victor behaved as though the house already belonged to him. He came into the kitchen wearing the charcoal cardigan he reserved for occasions when he wanted to appear reasonable, the kind of sweater that made people assume he was a sensible man. He poured coffee, unfolded the newspaper, and didn't look at me. 41 years of marriage. And suddenly I had become background noise. Morning, I said. He nodded faintly, eyes still on the paper. There was an article about rising property taxes in the district. Victor tapped the page with one finger, as if the universe itself had arranged the headline for his benefit. See, he said, another reason this place needs proper management. Proper management. That was a new phrase in Victor's vocabulary. Apparently, I had been mismanaging the home I had maintained. For 4 decades, I buttered a piece of toast and watched him over my teacup. What time is your lawyer expecting you today? I asked. Victor looked up sharply. Who said I'm seeing him today? You did, I replied calmly. Yesterday, when you said Marcus had already prepared the documents. Victor studied me for a moment, deciding whether I had simply been lucky with my guess. Then he shrugged. Late afternoon, he admitted. We're reviewing the next steps. Of course they were. Men like Victor never liked leaving things to chance. He folded the newspaper and stood. Oh, he added casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him. Someone will be coming by this afternoon to look at the property. I set down my cup. Look at the property. A valuation agent, he said. Just preliminary. Preliminary. The word echoed through the kitchen like a quiet insult. You're already planning to sell the house. I asked, Not immediately, Victor said with a thin smile. But Marcus suggested we get an updated valuation for the division of assets. Division, such a polite word for something else entirely. I finished my tea and carried the cup to the sink. What time? I asked. 2 o'clock. Good, I said. Victor frowned slightly. Good. I'd hate to miss it. For the first time since he announced the divorce, Victor looked genuinely uncertain. You don't need to be here, he said. It's just a walk-through. I live here, I replied. The silence stretched between us. Victor cleared his throat, grabbed his coat, and muttered, "Suit yourself," on his way to the door. A moment later, his car faded down the road. The house was quiet again. I walked slowly through the living room, running my fingers along the back of the old linen sofa. Victor had bought it during what he liked to call his successful years. It smelled faintly of cedar and the herbal lotion he rubbed on his hands. Each winter, every corner of this house held some fragment of our history, but history alone wasn't what mattered anymore. Paper mattered, documents, signatures, ownership. I went back to the kitchen and pulled the leather folder from the drawer. The paper inside had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink was still perfectly clear. My name, the legal language, the trust structure, that Claire Donovan had helped me establish. After the terrible year, Victor nearly ruined everything with one of his investments. He had called it a temporary setback. I had called it a warning. That was the year I learned something essential about my husband. Victor believed money solved problems, but he never paid attention to how money was protected. He signed documents the way most people sign birthday cards, quickly, without reading past the first line. That habit had quietly saved me more than once. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to the drawer, just as the telephone rang. Almost nobody called the landline anymore. I picked it up. "Hello," a calm, steady voice answered. "Mrs. Hargrove, this is Claire Donovan. We spoke briefly last evening." A quiet sense of relief settled into my chest. Claire Donovan had the voice of someone who understood storms. "I reviewed the information you sent," she continued. "I'd like to meet today if that's possible." "That would be good," I said. There was a brief pause. "Your husband seems very confident," Claire added. I looked out the window at the birch trees, swaying in the morning wind. "Yes," I said, "he does." "Well," Claire replied evenly, "confidence and ownership are not always the same thing." I smiled. "No," I said softly, "they aren't." We arranged to meet just after the valuation agent finished. When I hung up the phone, I noticed something unexpected. For the first time since Victor had walked into this house and announced he was taking everything, I wasn't afraid. The valuation agent arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. He was a young man in a pressed gray jacket, carrying a clipboard and a laser measuring device that he swept methodically across every room. Victor had not returned from his lawyer's office yet, which, looking back, was either careless or deliberate. I showed the agent through the house calmly. The bay windows, the refurbished kitchen cabinets, the new boiler I had arranged 3 years ago. He paused in the hallway and pointed toward the support beam I had reinforced after the carpenter's assessment 6 years back. "Quality work," he said, tapping it gently. "Thank you," I said. "I arranged that." He made a small note. Victor had not been home that week. By the time the agent left, I had something important, a documented record that nearly every meaningful improvement to this house over the past decade had been arranged and paid for by me. At 4 o'clock, I drove into town to meet Claire Donovan. Her office was above a small bookshop on Meridian Street, and the stairs smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Claire was exactly as I had imagined her. Sharp eyes, composed, not warm exactly, but reassuring in the way that competent people are reassuring. She laid the trust documents on the desk between us and went through them slowly and carefully. "This is well structured," she said quietly. "Whoever set this up understood what they were protecting. A lawyer I used 12 years ago, I told her, after Victor lost a significant amount of money, investing in a technology company run by someone he met at a golf dinner." Claire raised an eyebrow. "The man disappeared 6 months later, along with a considerable portion of Victor's savings." I confirmed. Claire tapped the trust document. "And this was Victor's response, to protect the house." "No," I said. "It was mine." Claire nodded slowly. "He signed the transfer documents." "He did," I said, without reading them. A small, professional smile crossed Claire's face. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, "your husband is about to make an argument in court that rests entirely on a foundation that no longer exists." I folded my hands in my lap. "I know," I said. 2 days after the valuation agent's visit, Victor tried something new: boxes. I came downstairs on a Wednesday morning to find 3 cardboard boxes sitting in the middle of the living room. My boxes. I recognized the winter coats folded on top. Before I had even taken 3 steps into the room, Victor was standing near the fireplace with his phone in one hand and a yellow legal pad in the other. "What is this?" I asked. He didn't look up immediately. "Just organizing." "Organizing what?" "Your things." I walked forward slowly. Inside the first box were my scarves, 2 cookbooks, and the small cedarwood spice grinder I had bought years ago from a market stall in the old quarter of town. The vendor had guaranteed it worked best for cardamom. I used it every autumn when I made spiced apple cake. Victor had tipped everything in together like items from a garage sale. "You went through my cupboards?" I asked. He finally looked up. "Well, someone has to start separating things." "Separating." "You won't be staying here much longer," he said. The words sat in the room like smoke. I folded my arms. "That decision hasn't been made." Victor smirked. "Oh, Eleanor, it has. Marcus says it's better if we start preparing now. Makes the transition easier." Transition. That word again, as if he were rearranging furniture instead of dismantling a marriage. I bent down and lifted the spice grinder from the box. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun through the window. "You know," Victor said casually, "you'd save yourself a great deal of trouble if you simply agreed to the settlement." "What settlement?" "The one Marcus drafted." "I haven't agreed to anything." "You will," he said with that familiar confidence. "And why would that be?" "Because fighting this will cost you money," he replied. "Time. Stress. Lawyers love stretching things out." He leaned against the fireplace like a man dispensing wisdom. "You're not exactly built for a long legal battle." That was another one of Victor's reliable habits. The quiet suggestion that I was fragile, too emotional, too old, too exhausted. It had worked on people around him for years. Just not on me. Not anymore. I met with a lawyer. I said calmly. Victor went very still, just for a moment. "You what?" "I met with a lawyer." The silence shifted. Victor straightened slowly. "What lawyer?" "Claire Donovan." The name clearly meant something to him. I could see it in the brief tightening of his brow. "Claire Donovan," he repeated. "Yes." He let out a short laugh, though it sounded forced. "That's entirely unnecessary." "Is it?" "Yes," he said quickly. "Marcus and I have outlined everything. There's no reason to complicate things." I sat down in the armchair by the window. "Victor," I said gently, 2 days ago you told me you were taking everything. That's correct. And now you're surprised I spoke to a lawyer. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since this had begun, he looked not just irritated, but slightly unsettled. I just don't see the point, he muttered. The point, I replied, is understanding what belongs to whom. Victor waved a dismissive hand. That's already perfectly clear. Is it? I asked. He stared at me for a moment, then laughed again, louder. You're really going to make this difficult, aren't you? I'm simply making sure everything is correct. Victor shook his head and grabbed his coat. Well, he said, heading for the door, Marcus will be thrilled. Lawyers love clients like you. He stopped in the doorway and looked back. Just remember, Eleanor, when this is over, you'll wish you had taken the easier option. The door closed. His car started and faded down the road. The house was quiet again. I looked at the 3 cardboard boxes Victor had filled with pieces of my life. Scarves, books, kitchen tools, objects he believed he could pack away like holiday decorations. I walked over, lifted the spice grinder, and turned it slowly in my hands. Victor believed this house was already his. He believed the paperwork in Marcus's office would prove it, and he believed that sooner or later I would give up. What he didn't understand was that every small cruelty, every box, every condescending remark, every confident phone call to his lawyer was quietly pushing this situation toward a place he would not enjoy. Because when Victor Hargrove finally walked into that courtroom, he was going to discover something very uncomfortable. The house he was so busy trying to take from me was never something he had truly owned. That same evening, I drove to see George Ashby. The accountant's office sat above a small bakery near the center of town that always smelled of warm bread and vanilla. I had known George for nearly 28 years. He had handled our tax filings since Victor started his consultancy, back when his hair was still mostly dark. George looked older now, more careful, but his eyes were still sharp. Eleanor, he said when I stepped inside, this is unexpected. I hope nothing is wrong. I placed a small envelope on his desk. Inside were copies of property tax records, renovation receipts, maintenance invoices, and 12 years of insurance premium payments. George studied them carefully. After a long moment, he looked up. Is this related to the divorce Victor mentioned? So Victor had already begun his campaign. Yes, I said. George leaned back slowly. He told me the house would likely need to be sold. I'm sure he did, I said. George adjusted his glasses and tapped one of the receipts. These payments, nearly all of them came from your personal account. That's correct. He nodded thoughtfully. I remember advising you about that arrangement years ago. Yes, I said. You did. George tapped the stack of papers gently. Victor never paid much attention to the property details. No, I agreed. He didn't. If you need documentation confirming these records, I can prepare an official statement. That would be very helpful, I said. George gave a small, measured smile. Victor always assumed he understood the financial structure of things. I returned the smile. That's an extremely accurate description. When I stepped outside, the evening air carried the smell of fresh pastry and roasted barley. I stood on the pavement for a moment, watching the slow stream of evening traffic through town. Victor was building his version of this story, but stories only held together when no one checked the details. And the details were beginning to line up. George Ashby was one. Tomorrow I would visit another, Robert Fielding, the notary, who had witnessed a very important document 12 years ago, a document Victor had signed without reading. I got into my car and turned the key, because while Victor spent his days telling people the house would soon be sold, I was quietly assembling the people who knew the truth. about how that house had actually been protected. And when the time came to present that truth in court, Victor Hargrove was going to discover that confidence is a very poor substitute for preparation. 3 days before the hearing, Victor tried something completely unexpected: charm. It started on a Thursday evening. I came home from the library to find the kitchen lights already on. When I stepped inside, Victor was standing at the stove, stirring something. That alone was enough to make me pause. In 41 years of marriage, Victor had used the stove, perhaps 15 times, and at least half of those occasions had ended badly. "What are you doing?" I asked. He turned with a smile that looked practiced. "Making dinner." I raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual." "Well," he said pleasantly, "there's no law against a man cooking in his own kitchen." His kitchen. There it was again. I glanced at the stove. He was heating tomato soup from a tin. Beside it sat a loaf of bread and sliced cheese. Victor had decided nostalgia was a strategy. "I thought we could talk," he said. "About what?" "About being reasonable." I took off my coat and sat down. Victor ladled soup into 2 bowls and placed them on the table, as if we were reenacting a peaceful evening from 20 years ago. For a moment, the smell of tomato and basil filled the kitchen, and I almost expected to hear the old radio we used to keep by the window. But Victor had sold that radio at a car boot sale years ago. He folded his hands like a man presenting a logical argument. "I spoke with Marcus again today." "I'm sure you did. He thinks we're making this harder than it needs to be." Victor pushed a sheet of paper across the table. "A revised proposal." I didn't touch it. "What's revised about it?" "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "Marcus took a more balanced approach." Balanced? The word almost made me smile. "And what does balance look like to Marcus?" Victor glanced at the paper. "You would keep your personal savings. And the smaller car, the car I already own?" "Yes." "How generous," I said. Victor ignored that. "And I would keep the house, the cabin, the retirement accounts." I leaned back slowly. "So nothing has actually changed." "Well, you'd avoid a court battle." "Victor," I said gently, "this proposal gives you everything you asked for 3 weeks ago, because it's fair." I looked down at the paper without picking it up. "You're very confident." I said. "Yes," he said, "I am." That quiet, unwavering belief. He had solved the puzzle. The case was already over in his mind. "You know," he added, "Marcus also pointed out that courts tend to prefer simple solutions." "I imagine they do. And selling the house would make everything much simpler." I tilted my head slightly. "Selling the house?" "Then we split the proceeds," he said. That was new. Not generous. Victor was never generous. Strategic. If he couldn't claim the house outright, perhaps he believed selling it would still give him half. I finally picked up the paper. The language was polished, careful, clearly written by someone billing by the hour. But the entire document rested on one very convenient assumption: that the house was available to divide. I placed it back on the table. "I'll have Claire review it." Victor's smile thinned. "You don't need to involve her in every conversation." "I do when lawyers are writing the documents." He sighed. "Eleanor, you're making this unnecessarily complicated." I looked at him directly. "Am I?" "Victor, you're the one who walked into this house and announced you were taking everything." He stared back at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite doubt, but closer to it than anything I had seen before. "You keep saying things like that," he said. "Like what?" "As if you know something I don't." I picked up my spoon and tasted the soup. Too salty. Victor had always added too much salt to everything. "Do I?" I said quietly. Victor leaned forward. "If you think you have some kind of legal maneuver." I don't think anything, I said gently, cutting him off. He sat back, studying my face for a long moment, and I could see it clearly for the first time since all of this began. A crack, not large, not dramatic, just a very small fracture in the wall of certainty he had built so carefully around himself. Daniel still believes the house will end up being sold. He said slowly, I'm sure he does. And if it is, Victor continued, you'll regret dragging this out. I finished my soup and set down the spoon. Victor, I said quietly, I'm not dragging anything out. I'm simply waiting. Waiting for what? I looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where he had declared victory 3 weeks earlier, waiting for the moment when everyone in that courtroom understands exactly who owns what. Victor laughed, but this time the sound wasn't quite right. We already knew that. I stood and carried my bowl to the sink. Behind me, Victor sat very still at the table, because for the first time since he had begun all of this, he was starting to suspect there was something he had overlooked, and there was something very significant, something that was about to become impossible to ignore. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. I arrived early, before Victor, before Marcus. Claire was already waiting in the hallway, her briefcase neat at her side, her expression steady. Good morning, she said. How are you feeling? Ready, I told her. She nodded. Good, because today is going to be interesting. The hearing room was smaller than I had imagined. Pale walls, high windows, a long oak table with chairs arranged on both sides. Judge Caldwell entered promptly at 9 o'clock, a composed man in his 60s with reading glasses. He removed and replaced with deliberate care. Victor entered with Marcus shortly after. He was dressed well, dark jacket, pressed collar. He had the look of a man who had arrived to collect something. He had already been promised. He glanced at me once as he sat down across the table, then looked away. Marcus opened with confidence. He outlined the marriage, the assets, Victor's financial contributions throughout the years. He spoke about the house, the retirement funds, the mountain cabin. His argument was smooth and well-rehearsed. Judge Caldwell listened without expression. Then he turned toward Claire. Claire rose calmly. She did not speak loudly. She never needed to. Your Honor, she began, we'd like to draw the court's attention to several documents that significantly affect the question of the marital residence. Marcus looked up. Victor straightened. Claire placed the leather folder on the table, the same folder I had kept in the kitchen drawer for 12 years. The Hargrove Residential Trust, she said, was established 12 years ago. Judge Caldwell reached for the document. Victor leaned toward Marcus and said something in a low voice. Claire continued. At that time, Mr. Hargrove had incurred significant financial exposure, following a failed investment in a technology company. I remembered that year precisely. Victor had been convinced he was about to make a fortune. The man running the company had promised extraordinary returns. At a dinner Victor attended through a golf club, he vanished 6 months later, along with a substantial portion of Victor's savings. What Victor had called a temporary setback had nearly become a complete catastrophe. Mrs. Hargrove sought legal advice. Claire continued, in order to protect the marital residence from any potential financial liability. Judge Caldwell looked toward Victor. That was prudent. Victor's lips pressed together. Claire placed the next document on the table. Under the terms of the trust agreement, the property title was transferred to the trust, with Mrs. Hargrove designated as the controlling trustee. Marcus looked toward Victor. Victor looked toward the documents, then slowly back at the table, and Mr. Hargrove sign the transfer documents? Judge Caldwell asked. Yes, Your Honor, Claire said. Judge Caldwell examined the page for several seconds. Mr. Webb, he said to Marcus, the language here appears quite explicit. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor. The trust grants administrative authority over the property to Mrs. Hargrove. Victor leaned forward suddenly. But that doesn't mean she owns the house outright, he said. Judge Caldwell looked at him calmly. Ownership within a trust structure can be considerably more complex than traditional property arrangements. Victor's voice rose slightly. But it's still our house. Claire spoke again, completely composed. Your Honor, the trust agreement also contains a protective clause, restricting the transfer or sale of the property without trustee authorization. Judge Caldwell turned the page. I see that. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Victor looked between them. What does that mean? He asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. It means, he said carefully, that the house cannot be sold or transferred without Eleanor's approval as trustee. Victor stared at him. What? The trust gives her that authority. Victor's face flushed. That's impossible. Judge Caldwell set the document down calmly. Mr. Hargrove, you signed this agreement. That was paperwork from the investment situation years ago. Yes, the judge replied. Paperwork that created a legally binding structure. The courtroom was quiet. Victor looked at me, the way a man looks at a locked door. He has only just discovered. You did this behind my back, he said. His voice had changed. The confidence was gone from it. Now, what replaced it sounded almost like disbelief. No, I replied quietly. You were sitting beside me when you signed it. Marcus rubbed his forehead. Victor ignored him. So you just waited, he said. I protected the house. I said, simply. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat. At this stage, he said, it appears the marital residence may not be divisible in the manner originally proposed by Mr. Hargrove's counsel. Victor sat back slowly. Not divisible. For weeks, he had been speaking about selling the house, telling people how the proceeds would be divided, telling Marcus, telling Patricia, telling anyone who would listen. And now the court was telling him something very simple. The house was not his to divide. The most difficult part for Victor to accept was not the legal language. It was the realization that the quiet woman he had underestimated for 41 years had seen this possibility coming, long before he ever asked for a divorce. What would you feel in her position, right now, watching the moment your husband's certainty finally collapses? All the months of confident planning, dissolved in a few quiet sentences. Tell me in the comments. Judge Caldwell looked across the table. The court recognizes, he said calmly, that the Hargrove residence is governed by the trust structure, established 12 years ago. Victor stared down at the table. His fingers rested on the edge of the documents Marcus had been reviewing all morning, just 2 hours earlier. He had been sitting in that chair like a man waiting to collect a prize. The property therefore remains under the authority of Mrs. Hargrove as trustee. Marcus nodded very slowly. Claire simply closed her folder. Judge Caldwell looked at the remaining asset list. There are still several matters to address: retirement accounts, vehicles, and the mountain cabin. At the mention of the cabin, Victor sat up slightly. The cabin is mine, he said. Claire glanced at him. The deed lists both parties. I paid for it. Claire didn't argue. She slid another document forward. Property records indicate Mrs. Hargrove covered the majority of maintenance costs over the past 9 years. Marcus sighed quietly. Victor rubbed his forehead. The story he had been telling himself, the clean, simple version, where everything neatly belonged to him. did not match the record on the table. Judge Caldwell closed a folder. "This case reflects a pattern," he said. Victor looked up. "What pattern?" "A pattern of assumptions." The judge replied evenly. Victor didn't respond, because that was exactly what it had been. Assumptions. He had assumed the house was his. He had assumed the paperwork from 12 years ago didn't matter. He had assumed Eleanor Hargrove was too quiet, too patient, too predictable to ever challenge him. And one by one, those assumptions had collapsed inside this courtroom. By the time the hearing concluded, the afternoon sun had begun to pour through the tall courthouse windows. The room felt quieter now, not empty, settled, like weather that had finally finished passing through. Victor pushed back his chair slowly. The man who had walked into my dining room and declared he was taking everything now looked like someone who had lost something he couldn't quite find again. He stood, gathered his coat, and walked toward the courthouse doors without looking at me. I thought for a moment he might stop, say something. 41 years of marriage is a long time to end in silence. But he didn't. The doors closed behind him. Claire packed the last of her documents. "Well," she said gently, "that went about as well as it could." "Yes," I said, "it did." We walked out together into the courthouse hallway, the same hallway where Victor had stood that morning, so completely certain of himself. Now it felt strangely peaceful. Outside, the air was cool and carried the faint smell of autumn. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't angry. Mostly, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Relief. Victor had believed the divorce would erase me from the life we built together. But the truth was much simpler than that. The house had never been something he could take, because 12 years ago, when I realized how easily everything could disappear if I trusted the wrong decisions, I had protected the one place that truly mattered. And sometimes protection looks very quiet, right up until the moment someone tries to take it away. My dear friends, this story leaves us with a real question. Eleanor protected herself long before the divorce ever happened. Some will say she was wise. Others might feel it was too calculated. What do you think? Write your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this mean something to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing them together.